Well, Elise, thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I am so happy to be able to interview you again.
Oh, it's so fun. I'm delighted to connect with you. It feels like just yesterday we were in Jefferson City talking about learning to see.
That's right. It seems like not that long ago, but man, times were so different then.
They really were.
Okay, so for those viewers who aren't familiar with my blog, I have a series of author interviews which include some this or that questions or first thing that comes to mind sort of questions. So I'm going to start this interview with a few questions I asked Elise for our Q&A on my blog. These are just sort of get to know you questions before we dive into the book. So first up, author you draw inspiration from.
Well, I have so many I could choose there, but I'll go with Louisa May Alcott because she was really instrumental to me. She opened up the world of novels to me as a kid. I lived right outside of Concord, Massachusetts, where the Alcotts are from, and it was in touring their house, which is now a museum, where I saw that little desk where Little Women was written in 2 feverish months. And that's really what opened my eyes to the fact that books are written by people. They don't just magically appear on bookshelves. And I was probably about 9 or 10 at the time, but it honestly gave me the idea that I could write a book someday. And so she's been my inspiration. I've read all her books. And then, of course, she was really the galvanizing force behind my first novel, The Other Alcott.
Where is your favorite place to read a book?
The beach, always by water. And I love the sound of the ocean. And I love to sit under an umbrella and just immerse myself in a wonderful book.
Book character you'd be best friends with.
This also is easy. That would be Anne Shirley of Anne of Green Gables. I was a huge Anne of Green Gables fan, still am, and we would be kindred spirits for sure.
When it comes to writing, do you prefer pen and paper or computer?
I do a little of everything. It really depends on the stage I'm in a book. So I really can't even answer that. I use it all. I'll try anything.
As you know, I usually ask authors about their favorite decade in fashion history, but today I was reading your bio on your website about your overly active imagination that you had as a kid, leading you to believe you were born in the wrong era. So I want to know, if you could time travel to any other era, which would it be?
Well, I think I always want to answer this in my heart to sort of the Victorian era. I mean, I love that era, the 1870s, that I wrote about in The Other Alcott in Paris with the Impressionists sort of turning the world of art upside down. But then I think of some of the very real parts of living during this time period and sanitation and costumes, which at first sounds so wonderful to wear. I'm not really sure I'm cut out for that. So I'll go with the 1960s because I've just finished an interesting book about that. And it was so fun to read about the fashion. And I'm really interested in the social upheaval of that time.
And what would you say is your signature drink?
Oh, I, again, would love to say something really fancy and glamorous. But honestly, these days, I'm keeping it simple with just a gin and tonic, something I can make very easily.
All right, so I'm sure there are some viewers who have not yet read the book. So could we start off with your synopsis of the book's plot?
Sure. So Fast Girls is historical fiction. It's based on the lives of 3 real women track stars of the late 1920s and 30s. And these 3 women will come together to race in Hitler's 1936 Berlin Olympics. And so they're pioneers and trailblazers. And this book has been a wonderful adventure for me. I've learned so much working on it.
I remember the first time you told me you were working on the Fast Girls. You were in Missouri researching Helen Stevens, and I was so disappointed in myself for not knowing who she was. And later that night, I asked my dad if he'd heard of her, and he was like, that kind of sounds like the Fulton Flash. So I was a little relieved that she hadn't been completely lost to history. Do you remember the first time you heard about Helen Stevens?
I found her while I was working on my research. And I don't remember the actual moment I came across her, but I can say that I was sort of stunned when I first found these 3 women and their stories because they really are amazing. And it really all came together because my youngest daughter is a swimmer. And she was working on a biography project for her library class at school. She was in 4th grade, and she picked a woman named Gertrude Ederle. And I had no idea who Ederle was. So she was a woman Olympian. She went to Paris in 1924 and won 3 medals in swimming. And of course, for most of us, 3 Olympic medals would be quite an accomplishment and we'd be done. But Gertrude Ederle was just getting started, and she decided she was going to become the first woman to swim the English Channel. It took her 2 tries, but she did it. And it took her 14 and a half hours. And she came home to New York, feted as an American hero. There was a ticker tape parade for her in Manhattan. President Woodrow Wilson called her America's best girl. She was a bona fide celebrity of her times, and yet I had never heard of her. And so she inspired me to start looking into the lives of other women athletes, because I have played sports my entire life, and I'm embarrassed to admit I've taken much of my athletic career for granted. I can join a 5 or 10K or a marathon without thinking about it. I can go out for a run and not be worried about being heckled. I can do all of these things that women couldn't always do. Again, I sort of had no idea of this. So I started digging around, and I do have a long history with running. And so I think I first found maybe Betty Robinson, and then Helen. Her story is so compelling. And I really believe she is a woman we would all know of. I think she would be a household name. I'd like to believe that. If World War II hadn't led to the cancellation of the 1940 Olympics and 44. I really think in 1936, she was just getting started, and we had so much more to take away from her amazing career. Unfortunately, it was cut short as an Olympian because of the World War. But she is just such a fascinating figure, and we'll be talking about her more, I assume. But yeah, so that's kind of how I found her.
So it's clear that you did extensive research. When you read the book, you could just see it all about Helen Stevens, as well as Betty Robinson and Louise Stokes. When we first met in March of last year, 2019, you told me a little bit about your visit to the University of Missouri archives and some of the cool things you saw there. Can you tell us a bit more on how you conducted your research and some of the artifacts you were able to see?
Sure. Well, I was really grateful to Helen's biographer, Sharon Kinney Hansen, who invited me out to Missouri, took me to Fulton to see where Helen lived much of her life. And I went to the Historical Society in Columbia and was able to visit the Helen Stevens collection. And there I was able to hold her size 12 track shoes, which was amazing. I was able to read through her handwritten diary of Berlin, those Olympics. So she has everything from her luggage tags for the ship to Berlin and home, to fingerprints that I think she needed to get her passport, to great old newspapers from her high school, the High Life. And so there were such a range of wonderful things, and just so much of it. It was, there's nothing as satisfying as when you're writing historical fiction as being able to visit the place where your characters lived and see things that were important to them, hold things that they might have once held. There's just really nothing that tops that. I mean, I'm so grateful for the internet and all the things I can access through it, and all the wonderful librarians and archivists who came to my rescue and scanned things, yearbook pages and things like that, and sent them to me. But there's really nothing quite the same as actually going and visiting and kind of seeing the artifacts of your person firsthand.
Do any of the athletes have surviving family members you were able to interview?
Yes, so specifically Betty Robinson's family was very helpful. They shared lots of photos with me. In the case of Helen, her biographer was a big help. Louise, I was trying to track down her son. I was never able to do so, but I was able to connect with some other friends and family of some of the women from this book. Family members of these women are so excited to really feel like these women they've so admired for so long are finally getting a moment in the sun. I've gotten several emails from various family members of different Olympians who weren't necessarily in my book, but they're kind of excited to read about it and want me to know about their grandmother. So that's been really exciting. I think so many of these women's stories have really not been told. I mean, we've read about Boys in the Boat or maybe Unbroken and Louis Zamperini, but there were women at these 1936 games and their stories are really amazing.
What is the most interesting fact you learned about the athletes or the Olympics while conducting your research?
So I've talked about how remarkable Helen Stevens' athletic accomplishments were, but Betty Robinson, who was one of her teammates, has a truly remarkable story that I cannot believe I had never heard of. And really, so women aren't allowed to compete in track and field until 1928. The first modern Olympics is held in 1896. women weren't allowed to be there. 1900, a handful of women are allowed to compete in just a few events that were considered aesthetically pleasing. But track and field was considered quite low class. No one wanted to see tired looking women. That's a direct quote. And so women aren't given permission to participate until 1928. And that's on a trial basis. I think they're allowed 5 events in 1928. And so Betty Robinson is this 16-year-old schoolgirl in Chicago. One day she is running for the train and a teacher thinks she looks fast and holds a time trial for her. Like the next day, she has such a remarkable time. He encourages her to compete in a local race, which she does. And within 5 races, she finds herself in this inaugural Olympic team. Such was the trajectory during this time period. You could go from just not even knowing about running to becoming an Olympian all within the space of a few months. Betty arrives in Amsterdam in 1928, and she's a real underdog. I mean, there are women from other parts of the country who have been running more extensively, but Betty has this real upset, and this all happens in the first few pages of the book, so I'm not giving anything away. She wins a gold medal. She then wins a silver in the relay. Like Ederle, she returns home to the United States, is feted as America's sweetheart. But then, only a couple of years later, she is up in a small biplane, kind of just up there for fun with a family member, and they crash. And Betty's found in the wreckage and truly believed to be dead. Someone tosses her in the back of a truck. It's not till she is discovered on the undertaker's table at the morgue. He sees her chest moving and he realizes she's alive. He alerts the doctors and they eventually revive her. She's extensive injuries. And they tell her, you'll be lucky to ever walk again, much less run, give up any Olympic dreams of 1932 or beyond. But Betty was a woman who did not take no very easily. And she has this, what is really an amazing comeback story that I had never heard of. I mean, I really think that's got to be one of the most remarkable comeback stories because she will come back and race in 1936 in the Olympics in Berlin.
The Fast Girls came out in the midst of the Black Lives Matter protests, and it includes some of the racism that Louise Stokes experienced. What was it like to read and write about Louise's experiences?
I knew the least about Louise going into this. Helen and Betty have biographies written on them. You can find a fair amount of stuff on them on the internet. But Louise, she's been really what I call the erased Olympian, where there's just not much on her. Even just in image search, there are very, very few images of her. So Louise was this young Black woman growing up outside of Boston in Malden, Massachusetts. But Louise doesn't leave behind a diary. There are no biographies written on her. And so there was a reporter from the Boston Globe who had written a story on Louise in the late 70s. On her accomplishments. And I was able to track him down, and he sent me this amazing file he accumulated over the years from small local newspapers in Malden. And he had found them all on microfiche. I mean, he saved my eyesight. It would have taken me so long to recreate this file. And he was generous enough to send it to me. Glenn Stout is his name. And so I was able to sort of piece together parts of her story, but it's been so remarkable given what we've seen happening in the last few months. I've really come to see Louise as such a central figure to the story, although her history really has been erased. Louise is one of 2 of the first Black women to qualify for an American Olympic team. The second was Tidy Pickett of Chicago. Tidy and Louise will come together in 1932, and they'll face many obstacles, some of which they may have predicted, some they don't see coming at all, in trying to earn and then maintain their space on this relay team. And I even have a bunch of photos. They're all candids from 1932 and 6, and they really reveal all these white faces. Louise and Tidy aren't in any of these. And so even within that sort of time period, their stories are really marginalized. And so learning about Louise and now putting her struggles in a greater context that we're seeing now, systemic racism, it's been really fascinating. And to be honest, I banked on Tokyo 2020, the Olympics that were supposed to happen this summer, being the vehicle for me to talk about this book. But really, racism plays a huge part of the story as well. And so with everyone's interest in Black Lives Matter and really shining a spotlight onto hidden stories from the past, Louise is more relevant than ever.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit. You've written books set in a couple of different time periods, including the late 1800s for the other Alcott, and Learning to See and Fast Girls are both set like pre-World War II leading into the war. Do you have a favorite time period to write about?
You know, it's not the time period. It's funny. I would think there's clearly something about me right now in the 30s, but it really is usually the themes that draw me to these books much more than the time period. It's like the chemistry of really just finding someone who I'm willing to spend several years like immersing myself in their story and their life. That's what really drives the decision for me about what I'm going to write about, more so than the time period. Although I will say there is something, I mean, stories from the 20th century are really fun in the sense that there can be video from those, certainly a lot more photography. So there is something that makes the 1900s much more, I mean, they're much more easily accessed, of course, than history before that, I would have to say.
Well, earlier you mentioned that you might like to try time travel to the 1960s. Is that a time period you'd like to write about, perhaps?
So the current book I'm working on right now is set mostly in the 40s, but it has a little bit of a framing device that's set in the 60s to make a connection with what was happening in Vietnam and then also some wars that had come before that. So, and as I said, the 1940s, I'm giving you a clue there, I'm writing about World War II. So the 60s provides me a little bit of a bridge there.
At the beginning of this interview, I asked about your favorite place to read, but I also want to talk a bit about your writing process. Do you have a favorite place to write?
Well, I usually am writing here in my office. This is what you see in the background here. But I can often be found writing in my car when I'm waiting outside of my kids' various activities. I will say, of course, those activities have been very curtailed because of COVID. What's also been curtailed because of COVID is carpooling. So I'm suddenly doing a lot of driving because we're not really sharing our vehicles with a wide range of people these days. So I've been driving my younger daughter to her swim practices, and I've been honestly writing a ton outside of her pool. So I can be found in all kinds of places, but I do have, I think one of my most favorite places now I've ever discovered was a place I just visited in February, which I still can't believe now that trip happened, given I came home on February 29th, which was the day that Washington State, where I live in Seattle, announced a state of emergency. And it was the day of the first COVID death, I believe, here in the state. And I had been in Asia, specifically in the Philippines. And I have this photo of one day sitting there on this boat out by the island of Palawan, writing furiously on some research I had just done. We had done this boating trip out to a World War II wreck and dived all around it to experience that firsthand. And so not wanting anything that I had just experienced I didn't want to forget any of it. I started writing and my daughter took a picture of me, and I do. So that would probably be my favorite place I've ever written. That was pretty special.
That is a good one.
Yeah.
What is your process from the first spark of an idea to submitting your first draft? Are you a planner or a pantser, as they say?
I'm definitely a bit of both. I always have an outline, and I'm really pretty solid usually on where I'm starting with a book and where I'm ending, but it's kind of finding my path from the beginning to the ending that I spend a lot of time on. And I would have to say that it really, each book has presented me with kind of its own special journey. And so I do usually I write kind of usually about a 30-page synopsis of whatever I'm working on. And I share, my editor reads that, and we talk through the characters' emotional arc and any plot points. And then I often really have kind of a much more specific outline I'm working with. And so I'm constantly arranging that. In fact, here, I'll kind of swerve a little bit with my camera. So see all those index cards over there? I'm currently reverse kind of outlining a book I'm working on right now. So I work in Scrivener, which is some writing software, and I love it from an organizational standpoint. It's very easy to move files around, and files can be chapters or scenes. But I do like the visual of having things up on my wall and moving things around. So you can see I'm definitely someone who plots everything out, but I always love the good creative surprise that comes along. And characters never fail, no matter how much I think I have us on a course. They never fail to surprise me, which sounds so weird because they're of course created by me. But suddenly I'll be writing and the dialogue will take a turn I didn't really expect and didn't see coming. And suddenly my characters have kind of a new challenge on their hand. And to be honest, that is what I love about this job. That is such an exciting part of the creative process. And I really think that's why a lot of us do it, is to surprise ourselves, because I really think if you can surprise yourself, you're going to surprise your reader. So that is a lot of the fun to me.
Do you have a least favorite part of writing or being an author?
In retrospect, I love every day of writing. At the actual start, if you were to ping me and say, how's it going today? I might be telling you, I'm spending this hour just moving commas around. That's how it feels some days. So I love the process of that first draft where you can just be so messy and just start throwing everything together, getting your story down. Whereas then sometimes like the real nitty gritty of editing can be a challenge when you're really tearing your hair out about getting some things to line right up, or really trying to figure out some aspects of the research. That can be a challenge. But again, when you figure it out, it's always so rewarding. It's all worth it.
Your first two novels were focused on a single protagonist, May Alcott and Dorothea Lange, respectively. But Fast Girls had three primary protagonists. It seems having multiple protagonists might complicate the process a little bit. Did having multiple protagonists change your process at all?
Yes, it does. It does. It makes things much more complicated, honestly. The sort of braiding of multiple main characters together is a complicated process. I think it can be a really rewarding process, both for me as the creator, but also for readers. I think it can really broaden the story considerably. In the case of Fast Girls, a lot of people want to know why I didn't just stop with Betty. Her story is so extraordinary. Why isn't she just the main character? But I really felt that it was important to show a real range of experience in getting to the Olympics. And Helen is a real outcast at the beginning of the story until she really discovers what an amazing track star she is. She just was not like the other girls in her community, and she was a real tomboy. And so her story is one of real transformation, and which is different from Betty, who sort of starts as America's Golden Girl and then experiences a real challenge and has to kind of dig her way out of it. And then we have Louise, who's just constantly encountering challenge after challenge. And so I liked that. I think that there's something there for everyone. I'm often asked if I wrote the three stories separately and then braided them together, or if I wrote them kind of as I went along. And it's the latter. I really pictured my structure with this book as a relay race, which I always like when sort of form and function meet. And, each athlete is kind of telling her story and then passing the baton on to the next, and for a chapter, and then that story happened, and then and that made a lot of sense to me in this book. With that said, in the book I'm working on now, I did have one main character and then wrote a rough draft and thought, I need a second one to show a flip side of this. So I am actually now kind of writing a second main character story, and I know my touch points of how they connect. But so in short, each book can be a totally different experience.
I know you also teach writing courses. What advice would you give an aspiring author?
I always say I think reading is such an important part of writing. I know some writers say that while they're working on a project, they really can't read anything outside of maybe the research they're doing for their book, but that's not me at all. I'm constantly reading. At a certain point in the evening, I put away whatever I'm working on, even if it's the research books I have to read through, and I just pick up something totally different. And for me, that's so important. And I think there's always something to be learned from all different kinds of books, be it about structure or theme or writing dialogue, setting. I just love that. And I'm always kind of stealing ideas from how other authors have tackled problems or figured things out. I love having a really wide library in my brain to kind of draw upon for figuring things out and how to try tackling a new story.
Well, thank you so much. There's one last question. You hinted a little bit at the project you're working on now. Can you tell us a bit more about your next book?
Yes. So my grandfather served in World War II in the Pacific, and I really had wanted to know more about what he did. And so I started digging around, and, you know, often I find where you start with one book isn't where you actually end up landing on any book. So I started off exploring the Pacific Theater and wanting to know more about it. And while my grandfather his service was more geared in Japan, and he was on the USS Missouri when MacArthur signed the peace treaty with the Japanese, and he went into Tokyo with MacArthur, and one of the first trips by Americans into Tokyo. I actually then, while reading all this stuff about the Pacific Theater, found the story about these US Army nurses who are in the Philippines. So my grandfather never went to the Philippines. So this is where things started to diverge from where I started. And this was just such an amazing story where these women, many of them were just kind of American farm girls from all over the country who, this is the 30s, of course, think about leading up to the war. They were maybe tired of living on the farm. I mean, life was hard during the Great Depression, and they saw nursing school as an affordable opportunity. It was much cheaper than college, of maybe leaving farm life and trying something different. So many of these farm girls went to nursing school and then ended up signing up with the Army because you could travel all over the world. And so many of these women chose the Manila, which was the Pearl of the Orient at the time. It was a really coveted place to go. And so these women were there, and they are living the life when the novel opens. You know, they're playing tennis and swimming in pools and having a lovely time. And then the same day Pearl Harbor is bombed, the Japanese Imperial Army launches bombs and eventually an invasion of the Philippines. And these women end up serving on the front lines during the war. And then they're taken as prisoners of war, and they spend several years in captivity. But it is an amazing story of recovery and resilience and hope. And so I am so deep into this story right now, and I'm finding it gives a lot of perspective for what we're dealing with right now. I mean, the uncertainty of these women. I mean, we now know, of course, World War II ends, but they didn't really know how things were going to end in this story. And so being able to channel the uncertainty of today, I think, has made me really empathetic to these characters. And then also it's just been really comforting to think that we as Americans have lived through hard times before, and we will continue to endure. And so I'm taking a lot of hope from this current story. So again, I think it's a really inspiring story, and I'm eager to share it with readers in about a year. It'll be ready sometime in fall of 21.
Oh, good. Well, thank you, Elise. It was so good to see you again. I hope that we can get together in person again soon, but I really appreciate you taking the time to do this interview.
Well, I always love chatting with you, Ashley. Thank you so much. And it's great to see you on the other side of the country there. And I hope you all stay healthy. And I'm really grateful to everyone who's tuned in to hear a bit about Fast Girls and maybe learn some things and see how, while we like to think a lot of things have changed since the 30s, there are a lot of themes that are very relevant still to today.
Definitely. And I want to give a shout out to the novel Neighbor, who has copies available for purchase. So thanks to them.
Yes, thank you, Novel Neighbor. I'm so grateful to independent bookstores for really doing everything they can to connect readers with books these days. I have been reading a ton, and I'm just so grateful. I have some wonderful independent bookstores near me here in Seattle, and I'm just so grateful for the network all over this country who's trying to keep us finding hope in uncertain times. So thank you, independent bookstores. Thank you, Novel Neighbor.
Thank you.